So the semantic web was designed more or less to be like a web of data that can be processed by machines. And expanding on that, we now have linked data, which is about making that data linkable so that humans or machines can explore the web to find other related things. You will find in RDA that a lot of information that you may have recorded just in basic text notes can now be recorded within various fields, so that it becomes a lot more machine friendly, so that computers can take various aspects of that data and use it in various ways, which is it's much harder with just free text type notes to do that. RDA, so what's the relationship between RDA and FRBR? RDA uses all the FRBR terminology, and it uses that as the basis for the specific data elements that's used in bibliographic descriptions. It addresses the FRBR relationships. Relationships are a very important part of FRBR and therefore a very important part of RDA. And it also uses the FRBR user tasks as the basis for defining the mandatory data elements. What you will find that RDA is not, it's not an encoding scheme, so it's not tied to MARC or any other scheme for that matter. It does not give instructions for a display or presentation, and the only in terms of display and presentation, the only nod it gives to that is the ISBD punctuation, which is in an appendix. It's no longer a rigid set of rules. It doesn't even refer to itself as rules. It's more like instructions or guidelines, and because it's meant to be flexible so that you can break down the content and provide linkages, and then there becomes less reliance on the cataloguer, on cataloguer-created notes and text strings. At the same time, there's more emphasis on cataloguer judgment. So it's something of a double-edged sword there. So the differences between FRBR, RDA and MARC. FRBR is the conceptual model. That's the way of looking at the work cataloguers do. It gives the outline. It's the conceptual foundation. RDA and AACR are content standards, and they tell the cataloguer what they might want to record and how. And MARC, of course, what we use within the library environment, gives the packaging for the information so it can be shared with other libraries and beyond. And the move away from MARC, if you've been keeping up with things, there is a move away from MARC. The Library of Congress is now developing something called BibFrame. Please don't ask me anything about it. I know next to nothing about it. But that is planned to take the place of MARC. So all have different functions, but all are required for cataloguing. So RDA standardises how metadata content is identified, transcribed, and generally structured, although it's independent of metadata encoding. It also identifies a general set of metadata elements, provides a controlled vocabulary for use as a content of an element. And it's an extremely important building block in the creation of better catalogues and resource discovery systems. Because FRBR is such an important part, we're going to have to spend a bit of time on it. So FRBR, the functional requirements for bibliographic records. And FRBR makes these user tasks easy. And the user tasks that have been identified are: a user needs to be able to find, they need to be able to identify the item that they're after, they need to be able to select the item, and they need to be able to obtain it. And increased identification of relationships will give better information to users, and it also gives more flexibility in manipulating the data. So FRBR is a structured framework, as we've mentioned before. And in particular, it emphasises the context of works and their relationships to each other. Being able to group all the works of a creator, all the expressions of a work, for example, to show the translations and editions available, or all the manifestations of a particular expression of a work, are essential to fulfilling specific user tasks. So FRBR focuses on three aspects. An entity is something that can be distinctly defined, such as a work, a person, or an event. An attribute describes that entity. And the relationship is an association between two entities, such as produced by, created by, translated by. As we go through these, it'll start falling into place. You say, oh, I recognise that, I already do that, and you do. But now you've got different terminology and just a different framework. So I'm hoping that you will recognise a lot of what you're doing is not going to change greatly. It's just that when you get into the RDA Toolkit, you'll have to refer to it in different ways. So the key things of interest to the user. FRBR identifies three groups, and each have entities, and these entities have have attributes, and each have relationships. So the users expect bibliographic records to help them find, identify, select, and obtain the products of intellectual and artistic endeavour. The entities described are grouped under Group 1, Group 2 and Group 3. And two of the most important ones are Group 1s and Group 2. The Group 1 is work, expression, manifestation and item. And if you haven't been familiar with these yet, it does take a little while to get used to it. But again, you will start to recognise what we're talking about as we're going through. The Group 1 entities are the resource entities. We're talking about the work, expression, the manifestation and the item. The Group 2 entities are agent entities, such as person, families, corporate bodies. And the Group 3 entities are the subjects, concepts, objects, events and places. Group 1s are the products of intellectual and artistic endeavour. So work is the distinct intellectual or artistic creation. It's the big idea, and it's an abstract concept. And the expression is the way that work takes its form. And again, that's an abstract concept. It's not a concrete thing at this point, until it gets to the manifestation. And the expression is the physical embodiment of an expression of a work. And this is at the point that it becomes available, that it's published, that it's concrete. And this becomes more of a concrete entity. And the item is a single exemplar of the manifestation, a single copy of an edition of a book. So the work and expressions are abstract concepts. There's no physical presence. A manifestation and item are concrete items. They're the physical embodiment of the intellectual and artistic expression. This is often referred to as WEMI. If you hear people talk about WEMI, they're talking about works, expressions, manifestations and items. So we start off with the work. It's the big idea. It's the envisioning of the book or whatever it's going to be. And the expression is how it's realised. Is it going to be a written expression, or is it going to be a musical expression, or a spoken word expression. And then it becomes embodied into a manifestation, and that is when it achieves its physical presence. That's when it becomes published or becomes available to the user. And the item is a single copy of that manifestation. All these together are called Group 1 entities. Now, if you feel that some of these FRBR concepts are difficult to grasp initially, it's something that if you're going to use the RDA Toolkit, you have to come to terms with, because RDA is structured around FRBR concepts and it uses the FRBR terminology. So what you may have found in a fairly linear way within AACR, you may say, for instance, your 300 tag where you're describing the resource. What you're using there, if you go into RDA, you're using not only elements of the expression, but you're also using elements of the manifestation. So you have to understand those different pieces in order to find the instructions within RDA. And that's what makes RDA quite confusing at times. The Group 2 entities are those responsible for the intellectual and artistic content. The person, the corporate body, the family. So you've got created by, produced by, concepts that you would be familiar with already. And the Group 3 are to do with subjects, and they've been identified as concept, object, event and place, or any of the Group 1 or 2 entities, because any of the Group 1 or 2 entities can also be subjects as well. Now, this is where RDA is not complete. All RDA has done with Group 3 entities is it has a section about place, but it is yet to do anything about concept, object and event. Now, relationships. Relationships are very important within FRBR. So a work can be realised through one or more than one expression, and an expression can be embodied in one or more than one manifestation, and a manifestation can be exemplified by one or more than one item. So FRBR is built on relationships between and amongst the entities, and we need to recognise and record those relationships so that the user can navigate around the catalogue and group all the related items. We already do a lot of this. We already record relationships as former and later titles, or we use 776 fields to link the print and online manifestations of the same expression of the work. So we're already doing that, but RDA is placing a lot heavier emphasis, and they're encouraging more coded data about relationships. There are several types of relationships in FRBR, inherent as well as content relationships. The inherent ones are fairly obvious, so you might have a work is created by a person or a corporate body, or possibly a family. The expression can be realised also by a person or a corporate body, and the manifestation could be produced by the person or the corporate body, etc., etc. So these I'm sure you would recognise anyway. And we also have content relationships, and they're broken down into a range of different ones: equivalent, derivative, etc., whole part, shared characteristics. And we'll just go through a few of these at the moment so that you get an idea, a better idea of what they are. So we've got equivalent relationships. So they exist mostly between manifestations of an expression. So you're looking at something that is released at the same time. You might have a book published in the UK and a book published in the US. So that is an equivalent relationship. You have reproductions, you have reprints, mirror sites, facsimiles. All these I'm sure you'd be quite familiar with in your normal day-to-day work. Derivative relationships. So these could be work to work or expression to expression. So we're looking at revisions, translations, musical arrangements, illustrated editions, or a new work based on another work, a parody, a screenplay, etc. And of course we have descriptive relationships, reviews, criticisms, commentaries, annotated editions. So these, and there are a couple of examples of what are descriptive relationships there. Any questions with FRBR? Great, you understand it all. Very pleased. It does take a while. It's the terminology that gets you every time, I can tell you. And even now, they say when you start using RDA, that you should start using all the terminology that has changed. And I confess, apart from a few things, I don't. I still use a lot of the old terminology because that's what makes it easier in my mind. I would think that with a lot of the new cataloguers coming through, they'll be able to pick it up fairly quickly and they'll adapt a lot more quickly. So that's just a little confession from me. So we might go through a few differences between AACR. We'll have a look at the terminology and the transcription and some of the new MARC fields. Now, what's the same? Well, quite a lot actually, quite a lot. The instructions in AACR2 form the basis of the text for RDA. Many of the instructions haven't changed, or they haven't changed much. What you will find is they may have been reworded, and so you kind of have to relearn them again, but they mean the same. It includes lots of options and alternatives, as AACR did, but there are a lot more options and alternatives in RDA. It includes Library of Congress interpretations, as we've been used to as well in AACR, or we used it in conjunction with AACR. With RDA, now we also have access to the National Library of Australia policy statements as well. And we can still code records in MARC, so our records will still look much the same. But generally, if you do a record as a full RDA record, you'll have a lot more information there. And one of the fundamentals of developing RDA was so that they could coexist with AACR2 records. There have been quite a number of changes to MARC and a few little changes to the ISBD punctuation. But we'll come across those later. They have been pushed out in order to cope with the changes in RDA and to make it easier. So what's different between AACR and RDA? Well, what we've got, of course, is it's a user focus, and you cannot escape that in RDA because everywhere you turn it talks about the users. Format neutral, you no longer get the sections on books, microforms, audio books. If you're lucky, you might get something at the end of the instruction that gives special instructions for a particular format. You might get, after all the main instructions, you might get something for cartographic materials, if you're lucky. But they have taken account of that, particularly as there are some very unique instructions for some formats. The framework is very different. You've got the FRBR and FRAD, and now we have core elements. No longer, we don't have the levels of description anymore. Core elements can also be, they have core and core if. So they're core regardless of any circumstance, and core if there's a qualification. It has to be under this particular situation that you would apply that as a core element. They call them instructions, not rules, so that gives a bit more flexibility there. Terminology has certainly changed, and there's a huge emphasis on relationships, and transcribing data has changed. So now we have the principle of representation there, describing what you see. So there have been a lot of changes to MARC, and there have been a few ISBD changes. So RDA is compatible with MARC. ISBD is also independent of them. So RDA is designed so that data can be coded in other formats. And the advantage of this, changing and replacing MARC, will not require changes to RDA. Non-library communities can potentially use RDA to describe their resources. But we can still code RDA in MARC, and they'll still fit into the ISBD record structure that we're used to. ISBD has been changed slightly to accommodate the RDA and MARC changes. Another big change is the GMD. We don't have it anymore. It's gone. It's now replaced by new elements and new MARC fields. Now we use content type, media type, and carrier type. Initially, we thought that content, media, and carrier might be one of the hardest things we'll have to get used to, but apart from a little bit of angst about dropping the GMD, our staff seems to have adapted very easily to using the content, media, and carrier types there. So with the ISBD changes, what we're doing now is, this wasn't something that was initiated by RDA, but the ISBD appendix reflects this. So two of the things that, well, one of the things is in the publication statement, where we used to encode information, and we'd do the whole, the brackets at the beginning of the A and at the end of the C, we now enclose them in brackets in each individual element. And so it's becoming more distinct. Each individual element is becoming more distinct. That means it's becoming more machine readable, and so they can use each individual element easier, so computers can use them a lot more easier. And we've also got here the use of the content, media, and carrier types. So instead of the GMD, we now have a RDA content, RDA media, and RDA carrier. And these are controlled by lists within RDA. They're not terribly comprehensive, but they may expand, I really don't know. Sometimes you end up, depending on what you're cataloguing, you end up with something called other, and that's not terribly helpful for the user, which is a strange thing. FRBR user tasks are find, identify, select and obtain. And as I said, there'll be a recurring theme throughout RDA. Every section begins with a statement about the user and how they're going to use this information. So you really can't avoid it. That's not to say that we didn't do it before, but RDA is certainly putting a much bigger emphasis on that. On the left-hand side there, the RDA section just gives you an idea of how it's structured, where you've got, excuse me, in excuse me, section 1, attributes of manifestations and items. And this is where you'll spend quite a lot of time. This is where you'll find a lot of similarity. This is where you'll get a lot of the descriptive data that you're used to finding now. Works and expressions, you'll find more information about access points and titles. And we no longer have uniform titles, by the way. We now have preferred titles, but it's the same thing. And also under works and expressions, you have the odd things like forms of notation, content type, and illustrations. They're considered aspects of a work or an expression. So again, you have to understand FRBR in order to delve into RDA, in order to pull your basic catalogue record together. Relationships in RDA takes up the bulk of it. More sections are devoted to recording relationships than there is recording to the attributes, that is the descriptive part of the record. So our core elements versus the levels of description. So now you can see that the first level of description for AACR was fairly sparse, whereas the RDA core elements, and this is what you need to use to do a minimal record in RDA. I mean, some of this is format specific, like the cartographic content, but it does define all the core elements there. Terminology. Now this, you'll be referring to access points rather than headings, variant access points rather than C references, and preferred title for a work instead of uniform titles. Chief source and prescribed sources, that's loosened up a lot. Now it's called a preferred source. And personal authorship are now works created by a person, family, or corporate body. And also we'll be looking at attributes of FRBR entities, types of content and carrier, FRBR relationships, FRAD relationships. It gets rather difficult. So some of us still refer to access points, forms of headings. I'm sure we'll change eventually. There's a much greater emphasis on relationships, and they are key in FRBR and FRAD. And we have three types of relationships: primary relationships, relationships to, and relationships between. One of the principles of RDA is transcribe what you see, accept what you get, and remember that there's core and core if. So when you just transcribe what you see, you'll no longer have to worry about abbreviations. You'll end up with a much more wordy record, you will end up with misspellings because you're going to describe things exactly as they're written, and you will be putting notes in to make sure that someone can still pick it up even with where it occurs. And you'll be doing away with a lot of our old Latin abbreviations. Again, this is coming from what the user wants to see and being a true representation of the resource. So again, as I mentioned before, that you will have to make a decision as to whether to accept what other cataloguers have done, because on top of this you've got cataloguer judgment as well. And so someone might choose to put something in a structured tag, whereas your preference might have been just to put it into a note. So you're going to have to make those little decisions as you go along. So transcribing data. The idea is that descriptions will match the way the entity describes itself. So this is the principle of representation. And we need to be true to the actual resource. So this isn't really a new idea. We have in AACR been transcribing pretty much what we saw there, but because we were confined by card catalogues, we started, and the space limitations from there, we certainly used a lot more abbreviations, and we would not necessarily add all the access points that we could have. For instance, if we had 5 authors, we may have only given an access point to 1. But that just means that we weren't really describing things exactly as they were on the resource. And of course, the use of abbreviations is not always the most user-friendly thing to do. So, as an example of transcribe what you see, we would have dropped a fair amount of, or more descriptive information within the statement of responsibility in this example. On the item, it calls Margaret Stutley a doctor and James Stutley a reverend, and it also gives the place where they worked. We would just put that in. If that's in the statement of responsibility, you put it in. So abbreviations, inaccuracies will also become part of your records now. We no longer supply extra title information because that's not on the resource. If you want to supply extra information, you can add it as a note. Marks of punctuation, that has changed. And a big one, of course, is the old rule of 3. And that's gone. It's no longer there. You're not constrained by the rule of 3. So they are meant to provide convenience to the user, representation, common usage, accuracy, consistency, standardisation, sufficiency and necessity. So with RDA, and now with online systems, space limitations are not so much of an issue. And so for this reason, RDA discourages us from using abbreviations and applying things like the rule of 3. So now we have a lot more information. So abbreviations. We only use abbreviations occasionally, and they're only permitted if they appear on the source. So if it's on the source, you have it as an abbreviation, you can transcribe it exactly as is. But if it's out in full, that's exactly what you transcribe. You don't abbreviate it. You don't arbitrarily abbreviate it. There's no great need to. And so that we'll get away from the Latin abbreviations, and hopefully will no longer baffle our library users. So it's very much a take what you see approach, and hopefully that's going to facilitate better machine processing of information in the future. So abbreviations in the publication, we're used to using the old SLSN. Now, if we don't have a place of publication or a publisher, now we use the terms place of publication not identified and publisher not identified. There is also an equivalent for the date. You can also use date of publication not identified, but RDA encourages you to always try and find a date, even if you have to use a range of dates, because that just makes it easier for the user. But if there was absolutely no way of finding a date there, you would also use date of publication not identified. And similarly with extent, where we had a whole range of different abbreviations for pages and illustrations and some cull, facsims, etc., etc. Now we do it all out in full. So now we say pages out in full, and if we have an unnumbered group, rather than using square brackets, we will, if you want to, you can count them up. You don't use the square brackets, and you refer to them as pages of unnumbered plates or leaves or whatever it may be. Illustrations in full, some colour, everything, portraits, whatever is in the 300 tag you would put out in full. And I have to say that I have seen some that, particularly in the subfield B, where they're talking about the type of illustrations, you get almost a sentence there. Coloured and some black and white illustrations with this, that and the other. So it's entirely up to you what you do. But the idea is convey exactly what the resource has in terms of the illustrations, and make sure it's as readable as possible for the user. Again, with editions, we no longer abbreviate any editions. If it says on the source 3rd edition, that's exactly what we put down. Statements of responsibility. Here we've used in the AACR, we like our, et al, and that always made life easy for us. And we would give the first named person just an added entry. And now we will put them all out in full in the statement of responsibility. And you have an option of giving access points to all the authors, or there is an option where you can only do one if you want to. But also the first named author becomes the 100 tag rather than the 700, rather than defaulting to the 700. So we'll talk a tiny bit more about the rule of 3 shortly. But in the statement of responsibility, you put it out in full. Whatever information is there, you put down. Inaccuracies. Now this has caused a little bit of angst in places. So if we have inaccuracies in a title or wherever, we record them. We no longer do the SIC or the IE in square brackets. That's no longer there. So we record the accuracies as they appear, and wherever possible we would do another access point, like a 246 if it's a title, to say that, and to give the correct spelling, if it's considered important for the access. So here's some examples of those changes. In AACR, where we would have used either SIC or IE, whatever it should be. And it always was an odd-looking thing, really. And expecting people to understand it was probably a bit of a stretch. Maybe they did 40 years ago. I don't think they do now. RDA, now we would do it, we'd just transcribe it as is, and a 246 with a subfield I and A, so that displays, and so so the user has access to the correct title as it should be. The only exception to this is for monographs, the only exception to this is in serials. If the first issue of a serial has an error in it, you can adjust that error on that serial record, because hopefully in subsequent issues of that serial they have corrected the error. Supplied title information. Where we used to be so helpful, putting in square brackets things like program or proceedings, words like that to make the title a bit more explicit as to what it's about, we're dropping that now. We no longer put that in. We can put it in as just a general 500 note if you think it's important. Now, the old rule of 3. Omit all but the first of each group, followed by ... et al, when 3 or more persons or corporate bodies are listed. And I think any cataloguers here probably would have always liked that. When you had 6 different authors, you could just truncate it and it was just less work to do. But now you can put all of them. You can add all the persons or corporate bodies. You can have the longest statement of responsibility, and I have seen a few. There are a few coming through. But it's up to you to make that choice whether you use it. There is still some flexibility there. But this, of course, was just the product of the old card catalogue, where you simply did not have that room and you had the constraints of space there. So, and again, we're talking about this take what you see approach. So now, if we've got 4+ authors, in AACR we'd do the ... et al, and the first named person was a 700 as an edit entry. Now we have the option, we can list all of them if we want to, and the first named person is the 100, becomes the main entry. And you can add 700s for the others if you want to. Sorry.
If you do just have the 100 for the first person, it's okay to have all of them in the $C, but not have 700s.
You don't have to.
But you can.
You can if you want to. Your choice. It's the end result of this is a lot more work, and it's a lot more keying in for a lot of people. But you do have fuller records and you have more access points. So depending on the sort of library that you're in, you would need to make those decisions. But also what you can do when you have this situation is you can just put down, rather than the ... et al, you can put and 3 others or and 5 others or whatever. So that takes the place of the ... et al. And still you would keep the first named person and the 100, and you can still add 700s for the others if you want to. Sorry?
Sorry, does the and 300 and
Yes.
3 others go in square
Yes. Yes. Square brackets aren't used a great deal in RDA. We used it a huge amount in AACR, one of our best friends, really. just stick it in square brackets. There are circumstances where you can use them, but because we're transcribing most things now, you don't have to use square brackets anywhere near as much. But there are instances where you do. Now, this is one of the biggest changes in RDA, and it's the way it deals with the categorisation of resources. We used to have the GMD in the subfield H in the title field. And this is a big change, particularly for those who work with non-print audio-visual materials, is that in RDA there's no GMD, and it's been replaced by the 3 new categories and an expanded list of terms. So what are the 3 new elements that replace the GMD? We've got content, media and carrier. And this is meant to allow cataloguers to provide consistent and searchable information about all the content, physical and technical characteristics of a resource using controlled vocabulary lists. Each element can also be recorded more than once for resources encompassing multiple content, media and carrier types. And MARC has also given us specific MARC fields to record these as well. In RDA, only content and carrier are core. You have to record those. For some reason, I'm not sure why, but media type is not. I would have thought logically all 3 would have been core. This has caused a lot of consternation throughout the library community, particularly for those who use things like video recording or sound recording in order to perhaps limit searches and advise their clients exactly what they're after. And some libraries are even going to the they're still implementing RDA, but they're retaining the GMD because they see it as a benefit to their user, or they're using, or within their own systems, they're trying to use the 33X fields in order to generate a GMD or generate an icon to indicate the type of resource that it is. So depending on what sort of library you're at, and how your users adapt, you may have to make those decisions as well. I think users are very adaptable once they understand. It comes down to whether the systems can use the information that we're coding into these records, whether they can use that information in a meaningful way. So if we look here, this is just the old GMDs in AACR. One of the big problems with that was some of the terms described the content, others described the carrier, and others were about the media required to view or access the resource. So the ones highlighted in blue, like art original, cartographic material, etc., in RDA, they would be considered content types. The ones in red, such as sound recording, microform, electronic resource, etc., they'd be considered media types, and the ones in green would be considered carrier types. So as you can see, we have a whole hodgepodge in AACR, even though they've served us very well in the past, and for some libraries they'll continue to serve them very well. It's not really in line with RDA. So we now have the content, media and carrier type. So what's the content type? So content has to do with what something is, what sense is needed to experience it. And there's a few examples there. So text, so you're looking at a book or something that is text-based. Performed music, a sound recording of music. Notated music, it's a score. Spoken word, a sound recording of a book. Two-dimensional moving image, that takes a bit of getting used to, but that's a video recording. And the three-dimensional form is a globe or a toy, etc. Media type. Now you're asking what equipment is needed to use the resource. Audio, used for sound recordings. Computer, used for electronic resources. Microform, used for things that require microfilm, microfiche or a microfilm reader. Projected, used for motion pictures or slides, anything that's projected. Unmediated, this is something that can be perceived directly without a machine, like print books and serials. So you don't need anything to look at a book. You don't need any extra media in order. You just look at it. And video, used for things that require a video cassette player or a DVD player. And the carrier type is, what is it housed in? What's the carrier? So it could be an audio cassette, audio disc, computer disc, etc. Card, video cassette, video disc. You will find that with a lot of these that there will be repetition, but we have to work with what we've got within RDA. I'm just wondering whether we should break for morning tea. Is Karen here? Is Karen here? No, the other Karen Pickering, is she? Oh, she closed the door, so she might have gone out. Yeah. Rachel, can you just check to see about morning tea? Thank you. I'll just carry on. So if it's ready, we'll break. So I'll just carry on from here. So an example for using the content, media and carrier types for a book. So this would be very standard. We'd use text unmediated volume for content, media and carrier. Now, if you had a book that had a lot of illustrations and you wanted to bring that out, you would also use a content tag, 336 tag, you would use still image. If you had a book with maps in it, you might like to use cartographic material as well. So you can use multiple 336 tags there. For a PDF, you can describe it as an online resource in the 300. A PDF is still text. That's still its content. You would still use that. But you need a computer in order to view it. So your media is going to be a computer, and the carrier, it's an online resource. I'll just finish these examples of the content, media and carrier types, and then we'll just break for morning tea. It'll just be a couple of minutes. So with a music CD, performed music, audio and audio disc. Now, one of the things that we're doing here at State Library is, because we're constrained within the 336, the 33X tags to specific terms, in the 300, we might use a term that's in more common usage. You can use also, like for instance, the cataloguer here in the 300 is used the same term as in the carrier field. You can do that, or you could use a commonly used term like a CD. So that explains more to the user. The user is going to understand a CD better than perhaps performed music using audio and being carried by audio disc. So you have that flexibility within RDA, particularly within the 300, to use more commonly used terms. So a DVD, two-dimensional moving image, video and video disc. And again, in the 300, you can use the video disc or the more commonly used term, DVD. So any questions about the content, media and carrier types?
I'm just seeing in other records that they've got one video disc as one word and then hyphen DVD. You don't do that one? You don't use that?
Video disc hyphen DVD. If it comes in as an imported record, we just accept it. Yeah. I would have to check to see whether there is actually a difference in the two terms. If there's not, I'll just accept it. I'd either use video disc.
And you guys don't use the $B for the code, like TXT?
Yeah, that's what I was asked to, yeah. The second one, the second field.
The A and then
Yes.
the 2?
We don't at State Library. We made a decision not to use that at this time.
That's not cool.
No, it's not.
No.
And we were going to follow the national.
It's the machine code for
Yes.
the $A.
Yeah.
So
A lot of libraries do. Yeah.
if it says
So it's not
text,
going to be
if it
called
says
on
text.
later or anything?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Sorry?
It won't be, they're not going to say later on, well, gee, you haven't got that in there, the TXT, or...
Initially, when we started with RDA, we were going to follow the National Library, and they had said they were going to use the subfield B in the 33X fields, and then we were just going to follow them. And within a fairly short time, they decided they were not going to make this mandatory. In the Libraries Australia, they have a list of what they call it, an element set of RDA tags that they expect, that they're minimal record standard. And at once upon a time, initially they had the subfield B was required, and we were going to follow that. They decided that was probably going to be too much work for a lot of people, and they would not necessarily make that mandatory. And so we were glad of that, and we don't follow it. But what we decided that if we don't follow it now, in the future, because the information in the 33X fields should be standardised, it should be easy to change that programmatically. So we should be able to, say for instance, drag out on our system everything that's got $A two-dimensional moving image next to a $2 RDA content, and just plonk in the subfield B.
So if we've got time, we should probably just do it.
That would be up to you.
Okay.
It would be entirely your decision. If you've got time, and if you're willing to keep checking, I mean, if you do a lot of cataloguing, you just remember what the codes are. But if you don't do a lot of cataloguing, I think the error rate could go up. So unless you can do something like macros, so that you get that standardisation. So you don't have to do it, but you can if you want to.
Also, I was just going to ask, with the accepting the titles as they are, do you guys change it to upper lowercase, or do you just accept it if it's got lowercase?
We, yeah,
That's
this causes some angst, yeah, because transcribing what you see, if something has all in uppercase, and often it gets transcribed as being all in uppercase, it looks awful. It's like those machine-generated contents notes. It looks awful. You don't have to, because we also follow the punctuation conventions within RDA in one of the appendices. So if we were doing original cataloguing for something that had all uppercase, we would punctuate that appropriately. We would not put it in uppercase. That's our decision. We would follow the punctuation appendix, which is, upper and lower case, just sentence case.
You can actually make it look normal.
Yes, you can.
Good.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you, just wanted.
yeah. It looks awful. I hate it. Yeah.
Oh, and they don't cover us.
Hi, Jenny.
At the top there, where it's got the 85 minutes in brackets,
Mhm.
is that intentionally left out in the RDA?
Time, there's a whole range of other RDA type tags in MARC where it can be coded.
That's what I
Yeah.
wanted to know. Thank you.
But you could put it in if you wanted
Yes, I think you
to.
can.
Yeah.
I think if you chose not to use some of the other, and there's a whole range of 3XX fields where you can do a lot more coding of a lot of information that used to be in 300.
My OPAC only
Yeah, well that's it.
displays the 300
Exactly.
field, so I need
Yeah,
to put 300.
if you want to do that, if that's your decision for your
I'm going
institution.
to have to keep using that because it's not going to display content
Yeah.
unless I can get somebody
So
to
people,
fill that out.
you have to make those sorts of decisions. And if that's what your user needs, that's what you do. Okay, let's have a cup of tea.